Welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time poor but enthusiasm rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Matt Stone. Hi, Matt. How are you?
I'm really well, Kieran. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I mean, what I've noticed over my career, especially when helping other teachers, like you said, they will ask, how was that? Like, I don't care. This
Yeah,
that's not what
yeah,
this is about.
yeah,
Then it's not the old days, let's say.
yeah,
But
yeah,
um, but in my mind, I've got a blueprint or a roadmap through. Here's what I really want my novice
yeah,
teachers. If you're doing this, you're going to be more impactful than I was in my first couple of years.
yeah, yeah,
And at the other end of this road are the things that take years to develop.
yeah, yeah,
The example I always give is variation theory. Thinking about the nuances
yeah,
between each question in a sequence so it tells a story. You're not going to get good at that over a short space of time. What I often find is that when I have these conversations with teachers, I'll come back to them in 6 months, and if it's really taken and they've really explored it, they'll be doing it better than I ever could.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
I'll be all right, okay, and I'm going to take that idea and bring it into my next conversation because
yeah,
they just because so there's I never have the expectation you must do all these things because not all these things will be applicable
yeah,
in
yeah,
the class at the one time.
yeah.
Like checklists.
Yeah, one of the findings, one of the kind of um, approaches that I kind of have taken out from Charles Goodwin's work is this idea of cutting through the complexity of the conversation as well. Is so variation theory is a great example of this because you're never going to sit down with a teacher and coach them on variation theory and expect them to be able to do everything. It's like variation theory is huge. What you have to work out is like where's a good starting point. And I think our argument and my certainly what I find helpful in the work that we do is that you have to work out, well, what constitutes what's the action that is going to be the first action that we're going to take towards responding and making sense of variation theory in our teaching. And ultimately it'll break down to, it might even be, well, what type of questions are we going to ask? What makes a good question? And so the first step is going to be, well, we need to think about question types and you know how to script them and how to formulate questions, how to connect great questions to appropriate parts of the curriculum. And so we have to kind of really work backwards. Otherwise, the elephant is too big. You've got to, it's got to be a bite at a time. And that's very, listen, I think that's sensible advice in coaching generally. I think you've got to know the limits, know the kind of know the parameters of what you can coach on and what you can't in the process that you build. And it keeps coming back to this idea of it's got to be realistic. So again, I don't know how much you know about the kind of the repertoire of approaches in walkthroughs, but we've got something like check for understanding, right? You mentioned earlier, check for understanding is a great concept, but it's a concept, and there are lots and lots and lots of different ways that you can check for understanding. So if that's something that you're working on with a teacher, there's no point trying to coach them on a distilled version of check for understanding. You have to work out what constitutes that thing, So what are the types of tools? What are the actions? What are the things that we can do? And where's a good place to start? And that's where something like cold calling, think, pair, share, show me boards, that's where that becomes useful. And it's not an end in itself. And this is often a criticism of technique-based professional development. Is like it's not just about the technique. It's about where does that technique fit in the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve here. So if I'm trying to develop great systems for checking for understanding, a broad repertoire for that, then I need techniques to help me do it. And if those techniques are absent from my practice, it makes sense to work on those because they're procedural and instructional, and they can provide pretty rapid value to the teacher and to the students in the classroom. But it's iterative, isn't it? And that's the other challenge is coaching done well, I feel, is a slow burn. It's not like a silver bullet where you suddenly say, oh well, we're going to coach on all of these things. It's not. For an individual teacher, you might be working on something for a long, long time, bit by bit. And as long as that presents as a worthwhile thing to work on, then it's worth doing. It's damaging actually, isn't it, to jump from one to another. We see schools wrestling with this idea of time stamping their coaching cycles. So we're going to work on cold calling for 3 weeks, then we're going to do think, pair, share for a week, then we're going to do this. And it's like, that probably isn't going to happen. Some of your teachers at the end of that first 3 week period might have secured a really good cold call routine, others won't have. So what do you know, it isn't that black and white. It's got to be part of a bigger picture, and knowing where you're working, what you're working towards is a big part of that.
But I'm looking forward to 20 years time. Lots of the teachers who've thought about this are then really senior leaders, and the institutional knowledge in terms of this long, what do the EF called? They call it long and thin.
Yeah,
The
yeah,
slow and steady. I mean, I was in my last place for 5 years, 3 schools, and the aim was over those 5 years, let's get really good. Let's improve our practice. So there was no after year one. We had to be the best we could possibly be. But I found after 2 years, you get really sort of, if you cover the right things, you can make massive gains.
yeah.
But the expectation was always right. Where are we going to be in 2022? And then we'll take it from there. I've sort of lost track of where I was going to, but yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what that's like when we've got people who, for instance, maybe in their ECT year were being coached really well,
Yeah.
how that impacts on them as leaders, and will it be the default? Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I don't
Well,
know.
no, I hope you're right. I mean, it's such a challenging thing. So there's naturally an appetite often to try to evaluate the impact of professional development, and I get that. But it's just so difficult because really, beyond what you can see happening in the classroom, beyond what you can see happening in the moment, very, very difficult to pin down. I mean, you can't turn around in 5 years' time, results have gone up and say, oh, it's because we started coaching that results have gone up. That might be part of it, but lots of other things would have happened in that time. So actually it's about thinking about it in terms of like leading and lagging indicators of success. So I kind of think that's why goal setting is so important. You have to be really, really razor sharp with a goal at the outset of coaching. It's got to be worthwhile because it's the goal that carries it through. So if I'm starting a coaching cycle with you, Kieran, and we've kind of collected some data through observation and maybe video or whatever really we can cast a net around. We have to have a really tangible goal with a success criteria that is observable in the classroom. So I find it really helpful to use the if then so that structure for goal setting because it kind of contains in like a framework for insight in the sense that if is the problem. So if students are limited in their opportunities to demonstrate what they've learned, then use cold calling so that you're able to elicit evidence of learning from students. Probably a bad example because I was thinking on the spot, but you get the idea. Right? And what it can tell, what's nice about that is you have the problem, you have the solution, and then you have the success criteria, the thing you want to see happening. And if we do that at the start of the cycle and we revisit that kind of systematically through the coaching work that we do, the reason we know it's working, the impact we know it's having is that by the end of that cycle, students now have the opportunity to demonstrate what they've been thinking about, what they've learned. The teacher is now getting that information from the students in a way that they weren't doing that before. It's not about X amount of lesson visits have happened and the teacher can tick a box to say, yes, I'm now cold calling. It's about, is that routine having the desired impact? That is it doing what we designed, and are we ready to move on? And I think that often gets lost. So in a lot of the professional development that I see happening in schools is goals are kind of spurious or generic, and they don't really mean much to the people who are meant to be kind of working towards them. And the bigger question for me there is, well, how do you know it's working? Beyond like how that coaching conversation happens, schools are really proud of the fact that they've got, great, like last week, 25 coaching conversations took place. It's like, that's great, but what happened in, are they any good? What kind of things are you seeing happening in the classroom? So I think there's an area of complexity to navigate around the evaluative side of professional development. And I stand by the fact that the best way to see whether it's working or not is to get into lessons, get into classrooms, and see the things that you hoped to see happening. See if they're happening. Don't just take somebody's word for it, just see it. And that's the measure of it for me, is like, is it having the impact? Is it helping students in the way that we wanted it to help students? Not is it being done? So yeah, that's a tough one. Like, but there's definitely a generation of teachers coming into the profession now, I think, on the crest of a perfect storm, where it's like, we know more about how learning happens than ever before. We know more about how great professional development operates than ever before. There's a shift in culture around marrying those two things together. And that can only be a good thing. That's like, that's, as we were talking about earlier, that's a much better place than we were in for people kind of join the profession 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I think.
One of the things I always think about, when you're talking about in the classroom, I think you're absolutely right. That's where you get a sense of, are some of the things we talked about. I always try and set my teachers up so that they can explain why they've done what they've done.
Yeah.
Because good teaching is not flashy,
Yeah.
But if someone knows why they made a decision, I think that's that. I'm always like, look, this person can explain exactly why.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so important. Like, and when I think about inspections and things like that, if I'm being as generous as I'm inclined to be, like, what do they look for when they come in? What do they, if you have to meet with an inspector and talk about your lesson, what's important there is not what happened. It's, can you explain it? Can you talk about it? Can you rationalize why you did what you did? And I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation for teachers, right? I might get some pellets for that, but I just kind of think, I think it's reasonable that a teacher knows why they've approached a lesson in a particular way, and that they can talk about that. But I also think it further strengthens that idea of the role of dialogue in the coaching process. Is you've got to give them the opportunity to think it through, to talk it through. The first step of a great coaching conversation for me is like laying the foundation around the teacher's intention. So the first thing I'll do when I speak to a teacher is talk to me a little bit about what you've been working on. Talk to me a little bit about what you wanted to get out of the children here. What kind of things did you want to see happening? What did you want to see them doing, saying, thinking, achieving at this moment in the lesson? What were your reasons for that? And I just say, until you have that information, until you've heard it from the teacher, you can't really do much. You can't really coach them because you don't know where their starting point is. So yeah, absolutely. I think that's a reasonable expectation, but also a really important part of what we're trying to do in coaching.
I mean, I don't think you'll get any pellets because I think the why keeps them safe too. Why are we doing this? Why are we spending so much of our training time on X, Y, and Z? So I think,
and it doesn't have to be like we're the likes of you and I, Kieran, are in an echo chamber, a bubble of jargon and language, right? Which we probably love. I love talking about teaching and learning. I love talking about the cognitive science side of things. But that doesn't mean that the conversations have to be like that. The conversations just, they're human interactions. Just a teacher talking about, what did you want to see the children doing here? What did you want to get out of it? That's so important. It has to be, it has to be unfiltered. It's got to be, the language is. So there's not an expectation. I suppose what I'm trying to say is, it's not an expectation that every teacher kind of can regurgitate Willingham's model for learning to justify their pedagogical decisions. But I think it's a reasonable start that we can talk about it, and we have a shared language for talking about it. I think that's what is helpful about things like walkthroughs, is we can talk about the problems that are common across a classroom, that are not just unique to individual teachers, that generally are fairly universal. Like, how do we get all children paying attention? How do we involve all children in questioning? How do we ensure all children are being challenged? These are not unique problems. They're universal challenges of being a teacher. And so it's helpful if we could talk about them. And if teachers know that they're mitigating those problems, and they can explain what they're doing about it, what that looks like and how they're approaching them. I think that's really fruitful stuff when it comes to the dialogue side of coaching. Yeah.
And we've covered quite a fair few of the ways I think that we can build professional vision. Are there any that we maybe haven't covered in as much detail?
Well, one of the ones I really like from Charles Goodwin, there's a huge piece of work in his thinking around what he refers to as coding schemes, using coding schemes to make sense of complex domains. Um, and I kind of refer to this as like looking through a lens, right? And I think there are a couple of different areas that you can focus on here. So if we try and look at a whole lesson, if we're trying to look at everything that's happening in the classroom, the sheer volume of information that we're trying to kind of decipher is too much. We can't make sense of it. And if we then try and sit down with a teacher and talk about everything, and this is what I used to get. Like, I mean, I'm sure this is my experience of it as a younger teacher. Was like, I've had somebody come into my lesson for an hour, they've observed it, and they've written like 3 pages of notes about what happened in that hour, and about 2 pages of things that I'm going to do next. And it's just like, whoa, there's just like so much there. And sometimes it doesn't make sense when there's that much there, and when it's just uploading the kind of perception of the observer. So Goodwin talks about using coding schemes to help make sense of it. So we might use a macro coding scheme. So we might say, well, here's the kind of broad thing that we're looking at. So when I'm coming in to observe you or watch you as part of that coaching process, or when we're reflecting on your lesson, the big idea here is around securing attention, right? That's the lens that we're going to look at this of. So that means that we might see other things happening, but we're going to tuck them away because the contract that we made informally is around this thing, right? So we have a macro coding scheme. So we're talking about the classroom through that lens of securing attention. And that's helpful, right? Because that means that we can talk in a bit more detail about that thing. And it means that the teacher's not under pressure to kind of perform and make sense of everything else that's happening at the same time. It's just like attention. We're talking about this. And then we can have a micro coding scheme, a micro lens as well through this. And that might be the thing that we're actually working on. So through securing attention, I might be looking at signal, pause, insist as a technique that's going to help me do that, as a routine that's going to help me do that. And so now when I'm talking to that teacher, I'm talking through that micro lens of this technique, of this approach. And what I'm not doing then is I'm not jumping from one to another. I'm not kind of complicating things. I'm not saying, right, I'm coming in to look at signal, pause, insist. But then when we sit down, I'm going to say, well, do you know what? Your questioning was terrible. We need to work on that. That's when a conversation just falls apart. So what we're looking at is like applying a very transparent coding scheme that is agreed and understood by everyone. So that might mean that we have that kind of in front of us as we're talking about it. It might mean that when I'm watching the teacher at work, I'm making notes around that specific resource and saying, well, this is what I'm looking at. But it also means that there's pressure on the initial diagnosis, because if I'm only going to be focusing on that part, then I've got to make sure it's really worthwhile in the first place. So if I'm just sticking a finger in the wind and just picking something, then I'm not going to be having an impact on that teacher's practice in a way that's going to benefit the children. So it's all kind of tied into this idea. You have to have really, really astute awareness and diagnosis, and then a really, really kind of clear focus. So we're zooming in, we're looking at practice through that macro scheme, but digging into that micro level, we're able to talk about this thing, and everything else is just kind of sidelined. And it might be important and we might come back to it, but for now, we're just going to focus on this thing so we can actually see this thing through. I think that's a really important concept, and that, I mean, that resource already exists in lots of different forms. So like for us, that's a walkthrough. I think it's just such a useful thing to have in front of you when you're watching a lesson or when you're running a coaching conversation. But there are other things here that it doesn't have to be that, but there has to be some way where you can focus on this is it. This is the thing. Goodwin's example of this I really like is, again, in archaeology, it's something called the Munsell color chart. So it's like a scale of different colored earth. But obviously, who knew that different earth that has different properties and presents with a slightly different color. And so a novice can kind of look at that sample of Earth. And if you were just to look at it without anything there, it's just like, well, what am I looking at? Where's my starting point? Where's my way in? But if I can start to match it up and I start to kind of find, well, actually, this looks like it's this. I can apply that kind of coding scheme. And it looks like it fits here. That's my starting point. And then I can start to kind of dig into it at that level. I know something about it now because I've managed to kind of apply it to that scheme. And I just think that's a fascinating way of kind of shaping the work that we do with teachers is cut out the noise, focus on something specific, look through a very, very transparent and shared lens so that we can have a really detailed discussion around a specific thing rather than getting lost in the noise of everything else that's happening.
I think it's amazing. I actually want to be in school right now.
Yeah. And all of that. I just find it's interesting. Like there's lots of different ways to talk about it, but I always come back to the professional vision idea just because I think it's a really useful framework for the stuff we're doing. And yeah, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, I think those examples are very, very good. Because whenever you mentioned your first archaeology one, I thought nothing would clear my mind quicker. I could understand what it is to be a novice when
Yeah,
because I'm like, I have no idea, I have no frame of reference here.
I tell you, there's a really good I was thinking about this last week because probably like lots of people, got hooked on the Olympics again, and so I was watching. There's nothing like the Olympics to kind of fascinate people watching sports that you know nothing about. So I'm watching I was watching the springboard diving, and here's a great example of professional vision. Like you've got expert commentators watching the same athlete dive as we are, and I know enough about diving to be able to kind of get the premise of it. So I know that I saw a somersault and a twist, and I know that the less splash they make, the better. I know these kind of things, so I can watch it and think, oh, that was good. But I find myself watching a dive and thinking, God, that was great. And then the commentator just kind of rip it to shreds because technically they've seen something that I just didn't even know existed. They've seen something that is a hallmark of their domain. They have the knowledge to think about it in a way that is different to a novice. And it doesn't mean that we can't get the gist of it. I can see diving happen. I can see what that looked like a good dive, but I don't know really what's going on, right? And I think that's the key. That's what's happening in our schools, right? And it's not a disrespectful thing. It's like, how can we know everything? We can't see everything. We can't see everything that's happening. And it takes that kind of critical eye sometimes to be able to say, well that's really interesting. Let's look at that. And let's talk about why that was a good dive. Why was that a really successful dive? What's the difference between a 6.5 and a 7.5? What are the experts seeing that we're not seeing? And this kind of taps into like Gary Klein's work around shadow boxing as well. This idea of comparing expert kind of critique of a moment or a scenario with a novice critique of a moment scenario and thinking about, well, where's the gap? What are we looking at there? And yeah, I think it's great. And I think the more humble you can be about those things, the better. It's like if we watch these things, we think about these different complex domains. I think it gives us a good grounding into the work that we're trying to do in schools. It's like nobody can see everything, nobody's perfect, and we're just about kind of digging into what might need refining or what might need kind of tweaking here and there. I think that's often where most of our work happens.
Yeah, definitely. And then when the change does occur, you can't remember a time when you didn't operate the way you operated.
Yeah, because you can't put things back in the box. I think that's another thing. Like that's why it's great to talk about these things, like, and to have that kind of real investment in dialogue as part of your professional learning stuff. Is because even if a teacher is like a little bit skeptical, once it's out in the open, once you've talked about it, it's there. You can't put it back in the box, and you'll always start to see things and it'll think about things in a slightly different way. And all those kind of little compound effects add up, over time. So like I listen to the commentators when they're sharing their wisdom around Olympic diving, and I feel a little bit more empowered to I look out for next time. So next time I look out for that. I say, well, last time that the dive was a little bit over vertical. So that's what I'm going to look for next time, and I feel like I've acknowledged myself and I can see something slightly differently. And I suppose that's the kind of effect that we're looking for in professional development.
Your mention of compound effects and the Olympics has got me thinking about something that wasn't on the agenda, but I'd love to know your thoughts on it. Because obviously the 1%, was it James Clear talking about 1%
Yeah,
improvements?
that atomic habits and that kind of stuff.
But he used cycling as an example, and I
Yeah.
don't trust any cyclist not to be doping. So do you think that ruins the analogy, or does it still hold if he hadn't used that as his example or
I
primary
don't know how
example?
many teachers are doping. I don't know. Just got these kind of supercharged teachers firing around classrooms. No, I do think there's. Listen, I do think there's something in it. I think I'm really fascinated by the idea of like habit stacking, and that's where I think like technique-based professional development could be really powerful. Is that a single technique doesn't exist on its own, but it might pave the way for the next action and the next action and the next action. And where I see great teaching happening in classrooms is never. I never come out of a classroom thinking, God, that one example of think, pair, share was brilliant. It was how think, pair, share was part of a bigger routine, how other things have been stacked and tacked to that routine that really kind of benefited the students and the learning. So, you know, how the question was really, really deliberately crafted to get everybody thinking, how the children had been, really well coached to be great talk partners, and how the transition between individual thinking and paired talk was so fluent, and then how the teacher used, simultaneous response to kind of extract what students have been thinking about, and how that was part of the adaptive phase of what came next in the lesson. It's like it's the sequence that I always find impressive, that that's what you're after. It's not the one-off performance of individual techniques. It's the stacking of those great habits that make great teaching. And that's so I think that's akin to the 1%. It's like if I want to be great at checking for understanding, there are lots and lots of 1%ers that I can do along the way to build an overall advantage in my repertoire for checking for understanding without doping.
Yeah, I don't know what constitutes doping in the teaching context.
Coffee, just too much coffee.
Yeah, because it's anabolic steroids are the ones that calm you down before the snooker, aren't they? So it's the opposite of that.
Yeah, but I think it's an interesting one. And actually, that's where, so we do a lot of work with what we call clusters. So, lots of our schools, when we're working with them to implement professional development programs, it often starts with a well-designed, really thoroughly designed cluster of techniques. And that's essentially what it is. It's a habit stack. It's like these are all of the things that connect and enhance and serve other things, and I just think that's a really powerful. I mentioned earlier, like the bigger picture of your, professional development. I think that's a really powerful way of kind of working towards that bigger picture, is like mapping it out and thinking about this is where this thing fits with this thing, and this is how it's going to make this thing better. And I think we see that working really well when it lands in schools.
Speaking of schools, a couple of weeks' time, there's going to be a lot of people who may be expected to coach or maybe looking to get into coaching. Do you have any advice for anyone who's keen to get involved but doesn't know where to begin, or perhaps they're feeling a touch of imposter syndrome, which is quite common in schools, more common than it should?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I see this a lot, and I think it's fair to say like everyone feels a bit ropey about it, because we put coaching up on a pedestal, and it's hard because as much as I think that's a problem, I also think it's important, because as a coach, you have your colleagues' professional development entitlement in your hands, right? You're there to shape it, and I think that's a responsibility that you have to take seriously. So I think skilling yourself up as a coach is important. Lots of ways to do this. Listen, everything that I do in my coaching work, I've learnt from the real expert. So I, am hugely influenced by Jim Knight's work, by Josh Goodrich, Rachel Lofthouse, all of these people who just are so knowledgeable about what it looks like. But there's a risk that we make it unachievable for schools if we insist that this certain criteria has to be met. I think there's a guy, I'm sure you know, Chris Moyes, who I've engaged with a few times on Twitter, and he said this lovely thing once when we were talking about this. What does it need? What's the minimum kind of skill set that a new coach needs? And he says something along the lines of, they need to be kind, they need to have a genuine interest in supporting people's practice, and they need to be armed with some useful questions. And that's enough to get going with, right? And I'll add to that as well. I think it's helpful if coaches develop over time a knowledge about how learning happens so that they can talk about that and share those insights. I think coaches need to have command of a broad repertoire of potential solutions, i.e. teaching techniques, a playbook, as Jim Knight would call it. And I think coaches need to have a good grounding in core coaching competencies. So asking great questions, modeling techniques, providing feedback and opportunities for rehearsal and refinement. And then I'm going to kind of chuck a spanner in the works there and say, however, I don't think the pursuit of those things is a prerequisite to just getting started. So when we run our coaching program for walkthroughs, we run a coaching with walkthroughs termly program. And kind of one of the key messages I often give at the start is start now, because you'll learn a lot through doing it as well. So don't be scared to get started. And the reassurance I give there is around what we spoke about from the outset, is around, let's be really clear on the purpose of why we're doing this. And if the purpose is secure and understood and shared, then you'll be forgiven if your practice is a little bit formative. If you say the wrong thing in a coaching conversation, but the teacher you're working with has absolute confidence that you're doing it for the right reasons and the purpose is secure, it's fine. But if you say the wrong thing in the coaching conversation and you're doing it for the wrong reasons, that's when it becomes damaging. So my advice would be, like, do the work, do the reading, do the thinking, build that kind of concept knowledge around learning, around teaching, and around coaching. But get going, put yourself in a position where you can try it out, script it if it helps. There are lots of great kind of scripting resources out there. I found it really useful when I first started getting going with coaching to use Jim Knight's impact cycle, because he has lots of question stems and scripts, that like mini scripts that help you get going for those. And I think they're a really good starting point. I know things like Step Lab and Iris increasingly, even walkthroughs, we provide lots of resources to support coaching conversations. But I think that kind of experience of sitting down with a teacher, with a group of teachers, being the coach, I think that's powerful. And I wouldn't wait until you feel like you know everything to start doing that. It's part of the same journey. Does that make any sense?
Total sense. I love that advice, because I think it's both clear in terms of here's where you should focus your attention if you want to become a really effective coach.
Yeah.
There's also reassuring in terms of you just get started,
Yeah.
because some people will be thrown into the deep end. It'll be like the baby getting taught to swim by getting thrown into the pool. So I think that's both reassuring and
it goes wrong at times. Of course, it goes wrong at times, and there isn't a coach out there who doesn't reflect on a conversation once in a while and thinks I could have done that differently. And you learn from it. It's constantly developing, and but it's right to recognize that I think it's a privileged role. I think being a coach in a school is a privileged role, and I don't think it's appropriate for anybody to kind of to pretend to be a coach and not be prepared to kind of do the thinking around it. I think you've got to want to skill yourself up. You've got to want to kind of do a good job, know your stuff, become good, become useful to teachers. but that's a longer term process. I think that takes time. I've been coaching for around about 8 or 9 years now, and I'm still nowhere near as good as I'd like to be. I'd want to be. You know, I still reflect on conversation and think, oh, I could have done that better. I might try this, or I should have done it like that. And I just think that's normal. I think that's natural. And the imposter syndrome is a difficult thing to deal with, particularly in schools where there are politics around TLRs and hierarchies and stuff like that. And sometimes the system could tuck people up a little bit. If you've been thrown into the like lion's den as a coach, and nobody really has got a sense as to why that's happening or what's going on. Sometimes it can take a while to kind of build the culture around what you're trying to do, but not parade. I think the leadership have always got an important role to play here. So another kind of piece of advice I'd give is never, ever, ever, ever parade your coaches as your best teachers. I think sometimes there's a misconception that I've got this teacher here, they're a brilliant teacher, so I'm going to make them a coach. Firstly, there's nothing that says a brilliant teacher is going to become a brilliant coach. And secondly, it can so easily lead to resentment. Like other teachers, like being seen, watching this teacher kind of be put on a pedestal. So I always think like coaches who are prepared to train themselves, skill themselves up as coaches. That's the narrative. It's like I'm not doing this because I'm a better teacher. I'm doing this because I'm interested in coaching and helping teachers, and I've done a bit of work around it, and so I think I could be useful. I think for me, that's always the default.
Certainly the sense I get from this conversation is you love this kind of work as much as I do. So it's the thinking is about really, really interesting things that change all the time. Potentially complex systems, certainly complicated systems, and I find that fascinating. So I reckon most people who are listening and thinking, "Oh, it's not a chore I've got in front of me. It's an exciting landscape I can go and explore."
I really hope so. Certainly in the work that I do, and I kind of meet lots of coaches, but also, really there's a coaching role for every leader in a school, and sometimes I talk a lot about informal coaching as well. The idea that, the teacher at the end of a long day who goes to their mate next door and says, God, that was a tough day. that was difficult. Like there's a role for a coaching stance there as well. So I just think, go back to what I said at the beginning, like there's a real element of common sense around these types of conversations, these types of approaches that benefit schools in lots of different ways. And it should, I think when it's done well, it is fun. It's like, God, it's much better than, sitting through like a highly irrelevant inset delivery that you're never going to use. It's just like, it's like if it feels personal, it feels valuable, and it feels productive. I think that's a big thing. Like, it feels productive. It feels like we're doing something. And Kieran's great, and he's not here to judge me, which is nice. We're here to talk about the challenges that we have in the classroom. It's like I think it's a really great well-being incentive for schools as well. I think if you get it right, certainly the schools where we see it really ticking, it's like staff love it, teachers love it, coaches love it. Yeah, and what comes from that is that it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling process then, where everybody's invested in it, and ultimately the kind of students benefit. So yeah, I think so. It's absolutely the highlight of my stuff is working with teachers, coaching, and I'm glad it's not just me. That sounds great that you share that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure we're not the only two either. So I think that's fantastic advice. I've absolutely loved this conversation, and if it wasn't such a nice sunny day, I'd keep you for another 2 or 3 hours. But you're probably sweltering as much as the heat of the day. All I have to do is say thank you very much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Oh no, I've really, really loved it. Really enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, and hopefully see you again at a conference soon.
Yeah, you go to national?
I can't make the national this year, I'm afraid. It coincides, unfortunately. I think I'm in Amsterdam. I'm I'm going to work with the British School of Amsterdam for a couple of days, which is really exciting. So, unfortunately, no national for me this year, but certainly I'll be looking at some of the other events. I think it's brilliant, the research ed process. I love being part of that. So definitely we'll catch you at one of them.
Absolutely. And everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.